is Dr. Rupjyoti Talukdar. He's an eminent pancreatologist, and he's a director of pancreatic clinic at Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, Hyderabad, as well as he's a clinician scientist. He's the head of the Pancreas Research Group and Division of Gut Microbiome Research, Asian Healthcare Foundation, Hyderabad, India. And he's going to talk to us about acute recurrent pancreatitis, what is new. Over to you, Dr. Talukdar.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'd like to thank the Sri Lankan Society of Gastroenterology and especially Dr. Sanjeeva for this kind invitation and accommodating me at a new time point. I think my talk was earlier today, but because of my travel arrangements, he was kind enough to accommodate me now. And I know this is the last talk and all of you must be eager to go back and relax, so I tried to be as short as possible. And I think I have 20 minutes time or so, but the issue is in recurrent acute pancreatitis, I think there are not worth 20 minutes of new things. So what I would do is I'd take you through several of the important aspects on diagnosis and mechanisms, and wherever there is a new thing, I'll just fit into that narrative. Okay, so usually if we go by the standard traditional way of presentation definition, I'd have to disappoint you that still now there is no formally agreed definitions on this entity called recurrent acute pancreatitis. Traditionally, people used to say that at least 2 episodes or more of acute pancreatitis with complete or near complete resolution of symptoms in between the episodes, but we do not know what goes inside the pancreas, the pathophysiology or the inflammation. So it's really difficult to say that 2 close episodes are actually a continuum of the first episode or 2 discrete episodes. But for practical purposes, it is usually defined as 2 or more episodes with complete resolution of symptoms. So why is it so important? If we see this picture, hope this works. Okay, anyway, so this is a continuum. Yeah. So if we see some of the Western data, okay. So this is. Can you just make it the pointer, please? Right.
This one. This TV.
Yeah, but it becomes. That's okay. That's fine. That's fine. I'll manage. Yeah. So if we see this meta-analysis published in Gastroenterology in 2014, patients who have a single episode of acute pancreatitis progress to chronic pancreatitis in about 10%, but patients who has recurrent acute pancreatitis up to more than 1/3 of these patients develop chronic pancreatitis eventually in the due course of time. So when we looked at our data at AIG, like over 800 patients, so 400 patients with acute pancreatitis, out of them almost 10%, which is similar to the international data, that progressed to early chronic pancreatitis over time. And again, a similar number out of almost 400 patients progressed to chronic pancreatitis over time. So what we see in India is kind of similar to what is seen in the West, and I think the same holds true in Sri Lanka also. So what are the risk factors of recurrent acute pancreatitis? Any cause of acute pancreatitis which can cause a single episode can cause recurrent episodes. And I have given a whole list of causes, but I would be happy, or I love to divide it into 4 subdivisions. Like definite independent risk factors are gallstones or microlithiasis, alcohol and smoking, hypertriglyceridemia, a few drugs, helminths, and few genetic polymorphisms, especially the R122H of the PRSS1, and ampullary or pancreatic neoplasms. And things like hypercalcemia, biliary, microlithiasis are supposed to be risk factors, but they're possibly independent risk factors. They may not all the time independently act. And there are some non-independent risk factors, such as the structural abnormalities like pancreas divisum, annular pancreas, and few of the genetic polymorphisms that we commonly see in India, like the SPINK1, the cathepsin B, PRSS, 5' UTR, and the claudin. And then in routine clinical practice, something that is very often thought of as a cause of acute pancreatitis, biliary sludge. Actually, biliary sludge by itself is not a cause. I'll tell you why not a cause of pancreatitis. And again, sphincterophotic dysfunction type 2 and 3 are unlikely risk factors for acute pancreatitis or recurrent acute pancreatitis. So let us quickly take you through gallstone pancreatitis or recurrent biliary pancreatitis. Why is it so important? First of all, it is very important to realize that just mere presence of gallstone does not necessarily mean that the patient has biliary acute pancreatitis. So if we see in this figure, the gallstone would slip down through the cystic duct and common bile duct and cause a transient obstruction in the ampulla. And that's how the pancreatitis happens. So when there is obstruction, transient obstruction to the bile duct, so what will happen? There will be a transient rise in the LFT or the ALT. And it is now clearly shown that if the ALT or the SGPT is 2.5 times more than the upper limit of normal within the first 48 hours of onset of pain, it has a specificity of 95% of acute biliary pancreatitis. So it's very important to look at the LFT within the first 48 hours of onset of pain. Otherwise, it may happen the stone may pass out and the LFT will normalize, and we may fail to make a diagnosis of biliary acute pancreatitis. So this is very important. Secondly, what are, again, presence of biliary crystals and biliary sludge are often linked to the causation of acute pancreatitis. But if we see biliary crystals are just calcium bilirubinate crystals which are present in bile anyway. So just by seeing some crystals in the bile microscopy would not be enough to make a diagnosis of biliary pancreatitis. Similarly, biliary sludge is just mucin containing some of these biliary crystals. So these on ultrasound are echogenic, but they won't have a post-acoustic shadow. So sludge is just like mucus and it will pass out through the bile duct or through the ampulla. So it is not sufficient to produce acute pancreatitis. But if there are stones less than 3 millimeter in the gallbladder or the bile duct, if you see in that EUS image, the first image, you can see some bright crystals in the gallbladder. Here, if you see here some bright crystals, so those are biliary microlith. And it is the microlith that can cause actually acute pancreatitis. So those are basically stones that are less than 3 millimeter. And again, here, if you see here, you will see microlith in the common bile duct. So microlith are causes of acute biliary pancreatitis. It can be multiple, it can be single episode, but bile crystals and biliary sludge are not causes of biliary pancreatitis. So many patients unnecessarily get their gallbladder removed because there is a sludge in the gallbladder, which I think should not be the case. So when should we think that recurrent acute pancreatitis is unlikely because of biliary microlith? If the patient is young, it's very unlikely that it is microlith induced. If the patient's recurrent pancreatitis has a duration of 1 year, many episodes in 1 year. So if microlith was present in the early and by the end of 1 year, there should be formation of gallstones. So if the disease is more than 1 year and the child has more and more acute episodes of pancreatitis, it's unlikely to be biliary microlith induced. High number of episodes, because by a few number of episodes, the diagnosis is done usually. And absence of other risk factors of gallstone like hypercholesterolemia, triglyceridemia, obesity, those things, if they're absent, then microlith-induced pancreatitis is unlikely. Drugs, again, there are several drugs in the literature, and there was a nice review by Nissen Badalov who classified the drugs as class 1A, 1B, 2, 3, and 4. And the most important are the class 1A drugs, which was shown to produce recurrent pancreatitis after re-challenge. So that is important. So we need not in routine clinical practice remember all these 4 classes of drugs, just we need to remember a few drugs: valproate, mesalamine, azathioprine, metronidazole, zidovudine, isoniazid, losartan. So these are the few drugs which have been shown to cause recurrent pancreatitis by re-challenge. So these are definite risk factors. And earlier statins used to be, or statins were believed to be risk factors for recurrent pancreatitis, but there had been 2 very good population-based studies from the USA, which clearly showed that statins are actually not risk factors for acute pancreatitis. In fact, it could have a marginal beneficial or protective effect as a whole class of statins against development of pancreatitis. Again, an important risk factor to be considered in developing countries. So this ultrasound is from a young boy. So this was from my GI training days in New Delhi, like many years back. So this young kid, 11 years old, came down from Kashmir with severe abdominal pain. It was around 11 p.m. at night. Clinically, it appeared to be pancreatitis, the character of the pain. So we requested the ultrasonologist to come at night, and he was good enough to come at midnight. And when he put his high-frequency transducer on the abdomen, you see this is a nice roundworm. So half of the roundworm was within the pancreatic duct, and half of the roundworm was wriggling in the duodenum. So if we had waited till morning for the ultrasound, probably the worm would have come out, and we could never have made a diagnosis. So it's very important, especially in areas endemic for helminthiasis. If a patient comes with pancreatitis and no other causes are found, helminthiasis should be kept in the mind. Again, in endemic areas, there could be hydatid cyst-induced recurrent acute pancreatitis by the hydatid membrane. Now, all of you know about pancreas divisum. So pancreas divisum, does it cause acute pancreatitis? It's kind of controversial because pancreas divisum is the most common congenital anomaly of the pancreas. 7% of the global population has it, and maybe 1 or 2 of us sitting here can also have pancreas divisum. But majority of these patients are asymptomatic. Only 5% patients with pancreas divisum, acute pancreatitis. So could pancreas divisum cause pancreatitis by itself, or should there be another or a few other additional mechanisms? So we'll come to this a little bit later. Before that, let's look at the genes. So there has been several genes that has been described to be associated with recurrent acute pancreatitis, chronic pancreatitis. In the West, I already named that the R122H, PRSS1, that is an important definitive genetic risk factor of recurrent acute pancreatitis, hereditary pancreatitis. Fortunately, we do not see that gene in India. And it would be a good idea, I think, to see the genetic distribution in Sri Lanka also, because many things are common. Ancestry is common between many of the southern Indian people and Sri Lankans. So in India, we commonly see the SPINK1, the CASR, the CTRC, cathepsin B, especially this variant, carboxypeptidase. And recently, we and others from India have shown that in India also the claudin and the PRSS1 is common as in the West. What is more important in the context of recurrent pancreatitis is the risk of recurrent acute pancreatitis has been shown to be higher in patients with pancreas divisum and few genetic polymorphisms. So this study in the West, they showed SPINK1 CFTR variants. Data from India, AIMS, they showed SPINK1 CFTR variants to be present more frequently in patients with recurrent acute pancreatitis and divisum. So how does genetic polymorphisms cause pancreatitis? So again, this is basic physiology. In the normal human physiology, the trypsinogen would get activated in the trypsin by enterokinase in the duodenum. You all know that. Now, in acute pancreatitis, one of the sites of trypsin activation is within the acinar cell, and that can happen if there is a hyperfunction of the PRSS, hypofunction or loss of function of the CTRC and SPINK1. And the role of cathepsin B, we are not very sure till now, but we often find cathepsin B in Indian patients. And there is also ER stress, which could be caused by a mutation in the CPA, carboxyesterase. So this also we had published as a part of an international study. And then the other site of activation of trypsin is the ductal cell. And in the ductal cell, the activation could be because of low bicarbonate and increased calcium, which increases the acidity of the ductal fluid, and that causes trypsinogen activation to trypsin. And that can happen because of loss of function of the CFTR and the calcium sensing regulator genes. There are the other new genes that I talked about is the claudin. So these are the genetic polymorphisms that can lead to recurrent, or that can be associated with recurrent pancreatitis, but all of these genes are not directly disease-causing genes. These are disease modifier. By itself, they are not strong enough to produce. So then in that context, If the gene cannot cause pancreatitis by itself, is there any other factor? And those could be the environmental factor. If a patient is having a polymorphism and he is a heavy smoker or heavy drinker, or if he has hypertriglyceridemia, hypercalcemia, those patients are at a higher risk. Even though classically it is described that 50 grams of alcohol for 5 years is a risk factor for pancreatitis, but if the patient has a genetic polymorphism, even at a lower dose of alcohol, they can have recurrent pancreatitis. And I told I'll come back to the pancreas divisum thing again. So in this study actually, and this is something new, we published just recently, we studied like in more than 720 individuals having recurrent acute pancreatitis, chronic pancreatitis, and few matched controls. We tried to look at the association or the strength of association, how severe is the risk of recurrent pancreatitis in patients with pancreas divisum and presence of genetic polymorphisms. And what we found was the gene called cathepsin B was increased the risk of recurrent acute pancreatitis in the presence of divisum by almost 4-fold. So that was a real risk that was causing recurrent acute pancreatitis in this thing. And from this, we hypothesized that the genetic predisposition for IRAP, especially cathepsin B, could cause premature activation of the zymosin. And the pancreas divisum, because of increased ductal pressure, both together would reduce the threshold for clinical acute pancreatitis. If the patient do not have a genetic polymorphism, probably the pancreas divisum won't cause that increased risk. So this combination of the gene and the environmental factor becomes important as a risk factor. Then especially in elderly patients, many of these patients come with 1 or 2 episodes of pancreatitis. We do not really find a cause. So in those kind of patients, pancreas protocol CT could clinch the diagnosis. Sometimes small tumors which may not, so if you see here, the tumor is here, but it looks very isodense. So if we do not carefully concentrate on that part, we may miss the tumor. But here, again, there is a ductal cut off. The pancreatic duct is cut off here. So that could be the clue, that should be the clue for this patient that he may be having a mass lesion causing the pancreatitis. Again, in elderly patients, something called main duct IPMN. So if you see this video, mucin is extruding out from the ampulla, and these are the this is a pancreatoscopic picture where you can see the papillary fronds of the IPMN. So this IPMNs, or this papilla, would produce lots of mucin, which will cause obstruction to the ampulla and can cause recurrent acute pancreatitis. The same thing can also happen with branch duct IPMN. So this is a very nice EUS image of a branch duct IPMN. This is the IPMN, and it is communicating with the pancreatic duct. If you see here, yeah, here you can see a communication. So these kind of neoplasms or neoplasia can be associated with pancreatitis, especially in elderly patients. Now again, it's very common in routine practice. I don't know how is it in Sri Lanka. AIP is evaluated as a cause of recurrent acute pancreatitis if the other causes are not found. So is AIP really associated with recurrent acute pancreatitis? So first of all, AIP, or autoimmune pancreatitis, it's a special type of chronic pancreatitis which has bulky pancreas with a ring-like, or there is a capsule around the pancreas, and it may cause some kind of thing. So if we see the literature, autoimmune pancreatitis as a cause of acute pancreatitis is very rare. Just less than 4% of AIP presents as acute pancreatitis. And as a cause of recurrent acute pancreatitis is even rarer. So the threshold for thinking or considering AIP as a differential diagnosis of recurrent acute pancreatitis should be kept very high. And AIP type 2 is more associated with acute pancreatitis, and patients who has acute pancreatitis on the background of AIP, they won't have the typical stranding retroperitoneal fluid that is commonly seen in acute pancreatitis. So if a patient having recurrent acute pancreatitis without any other cause found, AIP should be suspected only if the patient has obstructive jaundice, because that is a part of autoimmune cholangiopathy or IgG4 related cholangiopathy, provided the gallstones or CBD stones are ruled out. If there are other organ involvement like aortoaortitis, it's a specific feature of AIP. Typical AIP imaging of a sausage-shaped pancreas, narrow pancreatic ductal strictures, and presence of typical CT finding of acute pancreatitis like peripancreatic stranding, you will never see a necrotizing or peripancreatic necrotic pancreas in autoimmune pancreatitis associated AP, and of course IgG4. So if we quickly look at the data from AIG, so these are patients who has acute pancreatitis. Most of them have alcohol and smoking related, and idiopathic are less compared. But when we see the patients with recurrent acute pancreatitis, they have a higher proportion of idiopathic recurrent acute pancreatitis. And if we split them by age, patients who are less than 18 years, majority of them are idiopathic, but as the age increases, the proportion of idiopathic pancreatitis comes down and proportion of alcohol and smoking related pancreatitis goes up. And I think that's a common feature anywhere else, maybe in Sri Lanka also it's the same feature this way. But why does this happen? And again, this is something new. I'll just spend 2 slides on the pathogenesis. I won't go into the molecular details. So earlier, most of the patients, most of the pathogenic study on acute pancreatitis was done on animal models. There are very few handful of studies done on humans, and these are 2 recent studies from our group that we published based on experiments on human pancreatic acini. And what we see or what happens is, first there is something called autophagy. This is an autophagic vacuole, and these are markers of autophagy here. So as a result of autophagy, what happens? The pancreatic acinar cells starts secreting cytokines. So this is what happens in biliary pancreatitis. This is what happens in alcoholic pancreatitis. So there is a time-dependent secretion of cytokines around the pancreatic acinar cells, and those cytokines will excite the circulating mononuclear cells, and that circulating mononuclear cells goes to the systemic circulation, and that leads to the systemic inflammatory response syndrome. So this is, I'm saying in a very brief manner. There are many things in between. I'll not go there today. So basically, the pancreatic acinar cell behave like an immune cell at the initiation of pancreatitis, and after that, the other immune cells and the neutrophils and monocytes gets activated and produce the other mediators. But what is more important in this context is, when there is activation of these immune cells and inflammation, there is also activation of the stellate cells. So this is a pancreatic acini, and these brown star-shaped cells are the stellate cells. And the stellate cells, when they get activated, they start producing fibrous tissue. And when there is fibrosis, that is chronic pancreatitis. So in the first 1 or 2 episodes of acute pancreatitis, the stellate cells get activated, but with time, again, they get apoptosed or they get deactivated. But if the acute pancreatitis keeps on repeating, there will be a threshold after which the stellate cell activation becomes irreversible. And once it is irreversible, it will start laying down fibrosis in a progressive manner, and that is the initiation of chronic pancreatitis. So if we can check the recurrence of acute pancreatitis by whatever cause, it is likely that we will be able to stop or halt or slow down the progression to chronic pancreatitis. So it's very important to find out the cause early on in this disease. So how to work these patients up? So the golden rule of the thumb is the right assessment using the right tool at the right timing. And why do I say so? We'll come to that one by one. So if we look at all the evaluative, the testing or tests to identify the cause of recurrent acute pancreatitis, they can be divided into level 1, level 2, and level 3 investigations. So level 1 obviously is the history, the LFT, triglyceride calcium, CA99, transabdominal ultrasound, and CT scan. And level 2 is MRCP EUS. Some centers perform bile microscopy. We don't perform at AIG, and we don't believe that bile microscopy can give us a diagnosis. I already discussed the reason why. So if we do the level 1 and level 2 investigation, approximately 70% of the patients we can have a cause. The level 3 test investigations are IgG4 and genetic testing. And again, sphincterophotic manometry, no one does, 1 or 2 centers in US does it. So additional 25% of patients will have a diagnosis. But in spite of all this, 5 to 10% will remain undiagnosed. So if we look at the CT scan, again, this is not rocket science. If we suspect a pancreatic lesion, especially in an elderly person, rapid weight loss, who has a new onset diabetes. So in this situation, it would be very important to go for a pancreas protocol CT upfront. Again, cystic neoplasm can be well found on a CT scan. Autoimmune pancreatitis can be well found on a CT scan. Now coming to MRCP and EUS, which is better or which is important for what situation? MRCP, again, the availability is more than endoscopic ultrasound, but EUS is much more expensive than MRCP. MRCPs are more accurate for pancreatobiliary ductal pathology. If we want to look for a pancreatic ductal stricture, side branch dilatation, early ductal changes, MRCP is the diagnostic modality of choice. If we go for, if we want to look for CBD stone or a microlith, early CP changes, very small neoplasm, EUS is the way to go. And one thing is important to understand, EUS is very operator dependent. So to give a real, a really reliable diagnosis, there should be a learning curve and a good level of experience in the EUS operator, which MRCP do not require. So the MRCP, again, I already said, I'll just quickly go through, can diagnose a CBD stone. So this is a nice CBD stone in the distal end of the CBD near the ampulla. Again, pancreas divisum, the first choice if you think is an MRCP. Choledochal cyst can be associated with recurrent acute pancreatitis, and here this is a beautiful classical picture. Choledochal cyst is a long common channel, and again cystic neoplasm can be very well picked up by MRCP. But there are a few caveats in MRCP. One have to be very cognizant about these while performing. So the MRCP usually picks up the fluid signals in the intestine, in the stomach, pancreatic juice, bile. So there may be lots of secretions in the stomach or duodenum which may obscure pathological finding in the bile duct or pancreatic duct. So basically secretion, the signals from GI secretion may obscure important findings. Then during episodes of acute pancreatitis, the sensitivity to detect pancreas divisum becomes poor. And if a lower resolution instrument is used, again, the sensitivity specificity will be low. So the tricks to take care of that is at least a 1.5 Tesla machine should be used. And then if a patient before MRCP drinks a glass of pineapple juice has manganese, and that would remove the negative contrast. And then secretin can improve the morphology. So if you see this, in this patient, there was lots of intestinal and gastric secretion, but after taking pineapple juice, this is what you see. You see only the gallbladder and the pancreatic duct, bile duct. So this is how the negative contrast was removed. And again here, what we see is only the pancreatic duct, the bile duct, and we don't see the junction or we don't see the union of the pancreatic duct and the bile duct properly. But when secretin was used, you can see a beautiful pancreas divisum here. The pancreatic duct has crossed the bile duct and opened through the minor papilla. So this is the beauty of using secretin. But the issue is secretin is very expensive and is not available widely. It is very rarely available. And then in EUS, again, we can find out gallstones, biliary microliths, cystic neoplasms, small tumors, early CP. But again, the caveats of CP is, now there are several studies that have shown that there could be age-related change in the pancreas, like a person above 60 years of age can have hyperechoic strength, can have some atrophy, can have some irregular texture. So those may mimic early CP. So it's very important for the operator to be cognizant about those findings if they do the EUS in an elderly person. And if EUS is done for detection of microlith, and if it is done late after the acute onset, the microlith may pass out. So that's what I meant by the right timing. So if we want to see microlith, it has to be done at an earlier time point after the onset of acute pancreatitis. On the other hand, if we want to look for early CP changes, for example, in an elderly patient, recurrent acute pancreatitis, or a child of recurrent acute pancreatitis, so if we do it too early after the acute episode, the resolving changes of acute pancreatitis can mask the early changes of chronic pancreatitis, or it can actually give a false positive changes of acute early chronic pancreatitis. So if we want to see early CP, the EUS should be done at a later time point. We should delay the EUS after the onset of pancreatitis. Then regarding genetic counseling, many of you might think, even if the patient has a genetic polymorphism, we cannot change the genes. We cannot treat that. So why do a genetic testing? So now we have evidence that First of all, if we have a genetic polymorphism, then the counseling against behavioral changes can be made stronger. And we can make decision if the patient has genetic polymorphism with pancreas divisum. Probably those patients would do better with a pancreatic sphincterotomy. And then there are a few studies, including one from our group. If there is this specific claudin polymorphism, then these patients progress rapidly to early chronic pancreatitis. So presence of few polymorphisms can predict the progression to CP. So genetic counseling could be important in a subgroup of patients. And what are those subgroup of patients? Patients who had documented idiopathic recurrent pancreatitis, especially children and young adults. Patients with a family history in the first degree or second degree relatives with acute pancreatitis, unexplained episode of acute pancreatitis in a child that requires hospitalization, and of course it can be done as a part of some research protocol. So finally, in the last 2 minutes, I'll just quickly take you through the broad treatment thing. So one, what we do at AIG, we use high dose of methionine containing antioxidant cocktail, which we have shown to be beneficial in chronic pancreatitis, and in recurrent acute pancreatitis also, it's supposed to reduce the inflammation. So the progression may be halted. We don't have hard data, but that's a belief based on the basic concepts. Then again, small volume frequent meals, normal home cooked, those are general standard things that needs to be done. Now specifically, if the patient has hypertriglyceridemia, obviously we'll treat them with anti-hyperlipidemic drugs. Endotherapy, has endotherapy any role in these patients? If the patient has microlithiasis or a stone in the common bile duct, of course biliary sphincterotomy could be helpful, but again here there is a caveat. There are 2 papers, so far one from All India Institute that was published by Pramod Garg and his group in 2007. So what they did was they followed patients with biliary microlithiasis associated recurrent acute pancreatitis. 50% of those patients continued to have recurrent pancreatitis even after cholecystectomy and sphincterotomy. And eventually those patients turned out to have chronic pancreatitis. So in those 50% of patients, biliary microlithiasis was probably a silent bystander. That was not the cause of acute pancreatitis. Pancreas divisum, again, especially if there is a genetic polymorphism, cathepsin B that we have recently shown, minor papillary sphincterotomy may be helpful, but there are no evidence on that benefit as of now based on RCT. One trial, of course, is going on in the United States. And again, sphincterotomy in pancreas divisum is inconsistent. The evidence is inconsistent and debatable, and we need more data to firmly say which subgroup of patients will be benefited. Again, there is a common practice of doing a cholecystectomy in patients who has idiopathic recurrent pancreatitis. You don't find any reason, any cause, take off the gallbladder. If a patient has documented biliary pancreatitis, of course it is justified, but before that, just rule out a stone or microlith in the common bile duct by a EUS or an MRCP, so that he do not get recurrent pancreatitis after removing the gallbladder. But if no causes are found, if the biliary system is normal, then empirical cholecystectomy is not recommended. And I strongly say this based on this study. This study was published from the Mayo Clinic a few years back. So what the authors did was they divided patients who developed recurrent acute pancreatitis after cholecystectomy based on the presence of ALT elevation in day 1 and presence of gallstone. So patients who had both ALT elevation on day 1 and gallstone, recurrent acute pancreatitis occurred only in 9% after removal of the gallbladder. If the patient had gallstones but no ALT elevation, recurrent pancreatitis was seen in 6% of patients. Patients who had gallstone but no ALT, 23% of patients continued to have pancreatitis after gallstone removal. And if the patient did not have ALT elevation and gallstones, 61% of patients continued to have recurrent acute pancreatitis in spite of removing the gallbladder. So these were the patients where gallbladders were removed empirically, empirical cholecystectomy. So 61% continued to have. So that means that elevated ALT on day 1 is the most important predictor of recurrent biliary acute pancreatitis. So that is why I emphasize here, and I also told you earlier on one of the earlier slides, that ALT on day 1 has to be done. In routine clinical practice, we see many prescriptions referred from here and there. They do all the tests, but they don't do the ALT, the LFT on day 1. which should not be the case. So I think this is my last slide, and at the end, I'd like to acknowledge the whole lot of people who have been working with me now, who had worked with me before, PhD students, postdocs, GI fellows, and my collaborators, advisors, and the funding agencies without which research wouldn't be possible. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.